So welcome everybody. Welcome to Café Historique. My name is John Lutz, and Café Historique is sponsored by the Department of History at the University of Victoria. We're really excited to be back here at Herman's. We've been coming here, I think, since November, live, presenting live, and Herman's has really embraced us, and they've upped the technology here. We're live streaming, so folks at home are watching us now. And they've also opened a brand new space upstairs. And so now there's two musical venues in Herman's, upstairs and downstairs. So if you go to their website, you'll find that you have the opportunity to come to shows up and down. And upstairs is there's two magnificent spaces up there. There's a big theater that holds about 200 people. And there's also a small kind of intimate bar space. And I think those are also available for private rental. So if you're thinking about an event, you might think about Herman's. The talk this evening is actually a substitution for a talk that we had previously scheduled, and the speaker had a conflict come up at the last minute, and so I had to find a colleague who would step in and speak. And you know, we call this series 10 Days That Shook the World. And though I'm looking around the audience, and I'm looking at my demographic here pretty much, and you know, those of us who are my age and maybe even older, we've seen a lot of days that have changed the world. I mean, we've lived through 9/11. We've lived through the formation of the EU. Some of us remember the Cuban Missile Crisis. We've seen lots of days that have shook the world, but it's maybe too soon to tell, and as a historian, one is hesitant about speaking about events that are so close to our present, but February 24th, 2022, I think is a day that has shook the world maybe more than any of these ones that I've just mentioned to you, a day that we've seen in our lifetime. Those of you who are regulars here will know that we have a little fundraiser we do at Herman's. Herman's is very generous to us, but there's still a little room rental that we have to pay. And those of you who were here last month will remember that I offered to donate the $200 room fee to Herman's if you would, instead of making the little donation that we usually ask for, donate to Ukrainian relief. And so this month, my colleagues in the history department have offered to cover that room rental and ask you to make a donation to Ukrainian relief. So I'm going to pass around my little lovely bag here and ask you to make a donation if you have some cash in your pocket or your purse. Now I think some of you are thinking, well, I don't carry cash these days. And if you're like me, you don't carry cash. And that's okay. What I'd urge you to do then is when you go home, before you forget, as soon as you get home, before you forget, to go online and make a donation to, and Serhy, it's to the Canada-Ukraine Foundation is what Serhy is recommending that we donate to. Canada-Ukraine Foundation. Now, I'm going to pass this hat around, and you're going to say, well, I'll throw in $5, I'll throw in $10, because that feels really comfortable. I'm going to ask you to throw in, if you're thinking that, I'm going to ask you to throw in $20, because that feels a little bit uncomfortable. And when you go home, if you're going to make a donation, think, well, I can donate $100 or $200, that feels comfortable. I'm going to ask you to donate $300, because what feels uncomfortable for us is nothing compared to what our brothers and sisters in Ukraine are feeling uncomfortable about right now. So we have two choices here in Victoria. We can sit here and watch the news, the newsreels roll by, and watch the horror unfold before our eyes, and we can stand by and be helpless and do nothing, or we can do something. And the one small thing that we can all do is make a donation. Now, if you're feeling more ambitious and you feel that's not enough, good on you, and there are other things you can do too, and including, I think we'll be looking for sponsors for Ukrainian refugees when they come to Victoria. So the province has set up a hotline, and if you are interested in that number, I can give it to you at the end of the event at Herman's. And you can call that hotline, and you can tell them that you're available for making donations or hosting people. Nobody has to feel helpless, because there are things you can do. So I'm going to pass this around. I'm going to start with my friends here at this table. Our speaker tonight knows this subject well. My friend and colleague, Serhy Yekelchyk, is a professor in the history department at the University of Victoria, but also a professor in the Department of Germanic and Slavic Studies. Or have I got that wrong? Slavic and Germanic Studies. He's jointly appointed in both departments. He was born in Ukraine and received his Bachelor of Arts at Kyiv University and his Master's from the Ukrainian Academy of Science. He came to Canada in 1995 to pursue a PhD, which he got at the University of Alberta, and he specializes in Ukrainian Russian relations. He came to UVic, am I right about this? 2001, 21 years ago. Seems like yesterday, Serhy. Serhy has written so much, I'm not even going to start by giving you the full list, but his work is right on the topic that he's going to be speaking about today. So I'm going to share a couple of his book titles with you. The Awakening of a Nation, Toward a Theory of the Ukrainian National Movement in the Second Half of the 19th Century. That's one. Another, Stalin's Empire of Memory, Russian-Ukrainian Relations in the Soviet Historical Imagination. Ukraine, The Birth of a Nation. And in 2015, a title that prefigures this conflict it's called, the book, The Conflict in Ukraine, of course, speaking to the 2014 conflict. So please join me in a warm welcome with my colleague and friend, Serhy Yekelchyk.
Thank you, John, for your introduction. I see that you are really good with fundraising. Thank you all for coming here today. Can you hear me well? Yes. Okay. So I don't think 1 hour is going to be enough to deal with all. Okay, kidding. I am going to end before that at approximately 50-minute mark. But I also want to show you the book, which is the second edition of my Conflict in Ukraine, which I'm going to send around this room as I speak, because I will never be able to cover enough of a complex historical detail in such a way as not to provoke more questions. And it happens to be in the question and answer format. It also has a slightly unmodest subtitle, which I have not invented. It's the name of a series at Oxford University Press, What Everyone Needs to Know. For that, I apologize as a modest Canadian professor. So I'm going to start today with a point which might seem obvious, that this conflict is all about history. But then I'm going to proceed to another point which says that the conflict is not about history at all. So let me start with the all history point. In July 2021, President Vladimir Putin of the Russian Federation has published an article about the history of Ukraine and Russia. It was called On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians. That was a curious text. Well, first of all, what country president would publish a historical treatise, right? It basically indicates to you already that there is a revanchist agenda somewhere in there. There is some kind of historical grievances. There is a feeling perhaps that that country is not getting enough of recognition, and perhaps its borders need to be moved. That's precisely what all of us, the Ukrainian experts, thought about this article. The article was essentially about Ukraine always having been part of Russia, Ukraine never being a real state or nation, Ukrainians and Russians being brothers and sisters. And therefore, the obvious next step would of course be to do what? Yes, everybody realized that in some time, a few months later, perhaps a year later, the Russian tanks will come rolling across the border. And so they did. Now, that brings me actually to an important point. If we try to unpack the Russian position on this war, it would come to the following. Ukraine is not a real state. There is no such thing as Ukrainian identity. Ukrainians are essentially Russians who speak a funny dialect. But if you educate them properly, they would be Russians. That sounds awfully imperialist, doesn't it? It really undermines the interpretation offered by so many experts that Mr. Putin wants to bring back the Soviet Union. That would be too simple. because the Soviet Union did recognize that Ukrainians were a separate nation. That's why Ukrainians had a separate republic as part of the Soviet Union. So we need to go deeper. We need to go beyond the Soviet Union. We need to cross the 1917 mark. And that would take us to the Russian Empire. And then indeed, in the Russian Empire, the state did not recognize that Ukrainians were a separate ethnic group. It actually claimed that Ukrainians were the dialectical regional variety of the Russian nation. And in order to make Ukrainians agree with this point, the Russian Empire banned publications in Ukrainian, just to make sure that all Ukrainians understand they are really Russians. So we are not talking about the Soviet Union, we are really talking about the Russian Empire here. But the Russian Empire comes with lots of other things. It has quite a bit of a baggage, if you will. And there are other things that fit really nicely with Mr. Putin's political agenda, such as ruling for life. That's precisely where you would want to go, the Tsars. Such as not having a real parliament. Done, check. Such as having the all-powerful police. Done. Such as constantly lying about what you have done and what you haven't done. Check. So it is then, it actually takes us into the world before modern nation states, before World War I and World War II, for all this love Mr. Putin has for the notion of the Great Patriotic War. He really belongs to the Russian Empire. That's what he likes. But of course the problem is that empires also come with issues. There is a good reason why the multinational empires in Eastern Europe collapsed at the end of World War I. They were not sustainable. They did not respond well to modern politics. So there is a reason why the Russian Empire collapsed. There is a reason why the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed. So Mr. Putin cannot really go straight back into that world. Even so, he wants to. Oh, and by the way, another important box to check is having extreme right-wing variety of kind of political Christianity as the state ideology is also something that unites Mr. Putin's Russia with the Russian Empire. The Tsars, of course, saw themselves as the sovereigns of the Russian Orthodox Church, and they insisted on the most conservative Christian ideology in place back then. It would perhaps come as a surprise to some of you that Mr. Putin is politically very much right-wing. He is not a leftist at all. He does like Stalin, but that's for a different reason. Because Stalin, you know, organized a very effective system of re-educating people in the camps, killed tens of millions, won the war, apparently single-handedly. The West was not involved. What else Stalin did? Oh yeah, the nuclear bomb, Mr. Putin's favorite toy. But all these reasons have nothing to do with the left causes. So I always find it very interesting when Western leftists think that they need to support Mr. Putin because he is anti-American. But he is anti-American because he is way more right-wing than the mainstream Americans. He is way more right-wing than Trump. He actually claims officially to be the head of the only true Christian state on earth. And that tells you something. So he is not a socialist. He is not a true heir of the Soviet Union. He really does belong in the period of the late Russian Empire. That brings me to another point. If he is in the late Russian Empire, then I think the revolution is coming. And indeed, well, there's a reason why there was a revolution in the Russian Empire. There were actually several revolutions in the Russian Empire. The first one in 1905, a massive general strike which involved even professors and ballet dancers, so you get the idea. Everybody felt it was impossible to live at that state. Impossible. Another one in 1917, the state basically collapsed on its own, and then the Bolsheviks came to build their own dictatorship. So Mr. Putin is, of course, aware of the fact that the revolution is coming. He's really scared. And when a little dictator with a nuclear button is really scared, he can do terrible things. But most of all, and first of all, he's going to do them to his own society. And here I arrive at my second point that's not really about history at all. I will continue playing with these 2 points as I go along. So let's see. If it is about expecting the revolution, then we do know about Russia quite a few things that would indicate to us that he is really up in arms against his own people. In 2011, major Russian cities saw significant rallies of protest against Mr. Putin's continued rule that were suppressed brutally. And as soon as they were suppressed, the Russian government moved forward with the program of limiting contacts with the West, expelling the Western NGOs, proclaiming as, or rather labeling as, foreign agents any organizations that received any funding at all, even charitable funding from the West, closing down one by one the few remaining oppositional newspapers, killing the oppositional journalists who didn't get the signal, and also assassinating the popular oppositional politicians, in some cases trying to poison them twice, and then finally putting them into prison. I'm talking about Navalny, perhaps the most prominent oppositionist left in Russia today, but of course he is in prison. So you see an interesting combination here. It is an expectation of the revolution in his own country that worries Mr. Putin so much. He really wants to suppress his own society, to leave no channels whatsoever for people to self-organize, to start a political movement, to demonstrate. The Russians who were courageous enough to protest the war against Ukraine, perhaps some of you saw them on television, showed up with tiny posters standing one by one. That's because by Russian law, if you're standing too close to the second person, you're already a group. And there are implications in the criminal code. And any protests are only allowed if they are allowed by the authorities, which authority, of course, would never allow. So, after 2011, there was a constant slide towards a dictatorship, which was not really aimed against Ukraine, but rather against the Russians themselves. Many of them obviously accepted the point of view of the government, especially the more conservative rural electorate. But the younger professionals in the big cities felt that their country was becoming something rather unpleasant. Quite a few of them left. A significant number of Russians actually left with the start of the war by crossing the border into Finland, Turkey, Armenia, the few countries that still received passengers from Russia. So Mr. Putin then is at war with his own society, and Ukraine is a projection of that society, and for a good reason. Because whether Ukrainians are in fact related very closely to Russians by cultural history or not, they happen to be the very large neighbor country in which lots of Russians used to have family and friends. And that very country also had politicians who liked Mr. Putin, and Mr. Putin was trying to manipulate the Ukrainian scene to help into the government for those politicians who were like him. But Ukrainians rebelled twice in the last 20 years. First, in 2004, protesting against rigged elections and also an attempt to poison an oppositional candidate, which really sounds like a page from Mr. Putin's book. And secondly, in 2013, another revolution against the president suddenly changing the course from establishing an association agreement with the European Union, not joining the European Union, just an association agreement, which is really about the various legalese and various standards in agriculture and such things. But it's symbolic because it shows the direction of moving towards Europe. And Europe here is understood as democracy, as the opposite of Russia. And so these two revolutions actually worried Mr. Putin so much precisely because they could be seen as an example to his own audience. Because in Ukraine, presidents kept changing. That was really disconcerting to him. And also sometimes they changed as a result of a successful, peaceful, in the first revolution, and peaceful until the last moment in the second revolution, mass action by the people who organized using the modern tools for that, like the internet, chats, social media, who had various channels because Ukraine still had, and always has, political opposition and oppositional newspapers and things like that. So there was always a way for Ukrainians to organize for something. But ultimately, it left a legacy of something very important, of a mobilized society, mobilized civil society. And so Putin's aim was to make sure that Ukraine does not succeed politically, because he likes his society very different, atomized. That's a Stalin recipe. Under the Great Terror, when everybody is only responsible for himself or herself in relationship to the government, to the authorities. People cannot get organized at all. So that's the Putin model. Ukraine demonstrated twice the success of the opposite model, the Western model, the democratic model. And that's why Mr. Putin needed to attack Ukraine, to make it sure that it does not succeed, does not become an example, does not, God forbid, join the European Union, maybe. And his methods for that are well tried and well established. Soon after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the Russian army supported a separatist movement in the Republic of Moldova, which is located between Ukraine and Romania. And ever since 1992, there is a separatist entity within Moldova, which is protected by the regular Russian army units, which is, for all intents and purposes, a Russian enclave there. And it is helpful because Russia realized that a country which has a territorial conflict, which has a separatist entity claiming part of its territory, would probably not be admitted into NATO, or perhaps not even into the European Union, because nobody wants to deal with territorial complaints. Okay, so if this is the tried and tested and tried strategy, which was also tried in the Republic of Georgia in 2008, and now successfully in Ukraine since 2014, then that shows you a trend. But ironically, this trend is very recent. It's not really, we cannot trace it to the Russian Empire. We cannot even trace it to the Soviet Union as such. It's the modern ethnic politics conducted by a former imperial state which wants to protect its strategic interests in the understanding that the West would think along the same terms. I recently, on BBC History magazine, on the podcast, ran into an argument with a British political scientist who was basically saying, well, yeah, Russia has legitimate strategic interests. Therefore, it needs to object to the expansion of the NATO. Therefore, Russia can do things. To which I said, I hope you have heard about decolonization. And he was completely out of it. I was so pleased with that comment. Okay. The statues, tumbling statues. Have you seen tumbling statues? And he was, of course, left-wing, right? So he didn't expect me to come from that angle. Well, when the statues are tumbling, it's not just about the left-wing feeling wonderful about themselves. It's also the moment when everybody re-examines whether we happen to speak from a position of power on behalf of somebody weak, such as the Eastern Europeans, who were stuck between basically first the Soviet Union and the Nazi Germany, and then between the West and the Soviet Union, and they never really had a voice. And the moment when they were given the voice, they were making their choices. These choices actually are not straightforward. You would think that all of them went immediately for the West, the European Union, and the NATO. It's more complex, but I wouldn't have the time now to argue for that. But literally, this is about hearing what these people wanted. If the world is all about the strategic interests of the great empires, that's precisely the kind of history our predecessors have taught in the early 20th century. That's not the kind of history we are teaching now, because it is the world which is about human rights, about reconciliation, about recognizing the historical wrongs, all of these things that come in package when we see the statues tumbling, right? So what is then happening in Ukraine is that if we take the position that Russia is entitled to this and that, it means that we are thinking about themselves, that we are thinking like imperialists. Completely. That's exactly what Lenin would have said on this topic, right? So the self-determination principle, the principle of the former colonial nations acquiring voice, is really important in our understanding of what is happening in the former Soviet Union. Let me go back briefly to my historical argument. It's all about history, it's all about the Russian Empire. The Russian Empire did not even recognize that Ukrainians were a separate ethnic group. They were in a curious position. They were a bit like Scotland to England. On other occasions, they were more like Ireland to England. So they could be seen as part of the empire. They could make brilliant careers in imperial administration, all the way to, being the chancellor of state or a morganatic husband of the empress and all kinds of things. So they were not really discriminated on the basis of race as such. However, if they identified politically as a representative of the downtrodden Ukrainian peasants, enslaved by the Russian Tsars, and if they insisted on keeping the heritage, speaking the language, then they became dangerous. And they could be exiled, arrested. All these journals and magazines would be burned. So the empire went after them in a very much the familiar way. This is the imperial hierarchy. The top is, of course, Russian culturally. You can join culturally the empire. There are degrees of whiteness here. You can join the empire culturally, but if you don't, then you remain forever, the country bumpkin. And that's the way so many Russians still think about Ukrainians. People, they know Russian. They should know Russian. It's so easy for them to speak Russian. But they would never ask themselves whether they can speak Ukrainian, whether it's easy for them to speak Ukrainian. You see what I mean? The colonial hierarchy, the importance, the domination, the downtrodden, and the superior. So this attitude was never really undone, never. Yes, the Soviet Union created the Ukrainian Republic, but that was the response to the political situation of 1917 to 1920, a fairly complex one, and I wouldn't go into it, except to say that Stalin and Lenin understood during the revolution that they needed to make concessions particularly to the peasantry, and particularly to the Ukrainian peasantry. But that was because there was already a non-Bolshevik Ukrainian Republic created during the revolution. The Bolsheviks suppressed it, by the way, by bombarding the Ukrainian capital of Kiev, a little-known page of history, but very well-known in Ukraine. In February 1918, the Bolshevik troops, straight from Russia, we know all the names of those wonderful Baltic sailors and other conquerors, liberators, they arrived and started bombarding the capital, the center of the capital, with very large guns from across the river. Fires started in the capital. Then they stormed it and slaughtered the people who happened to have IDs issued in Ukrainian. So eager they were to slaughter everybody who seemed like involved in the Ukrainian Republic that they almost killed the head of the Ukrainian Bolshevik Republic, because he too had an ID in Ukrainian, because they needed somehow to respond to, to the peasants, say, we are your republic. So he had an idea in Ukrainian, and I said, aha. And he also wrote a very honest memoir, saying when he realized he was going to be killed, he reached into the other pocket, in which he had an ID in Russian, signed by Lenin in person. At which moment, of course, the sailors apologized and said, oh, we are so sorry. We are going to leave some bodies on the street here, but you can go. But really, it was not an occasion for him, I think, to immediately say, stop, what are you doing? He doesn't say anything like that in the memoir at all. He just says, because there was a Lenin signature on the second AD, which was in Russian. You see some continuities here. Another interesting continuity is, of course, that in 1917, the Bolsheviks invaded the Ukrainian Republic from the north, claiming that it was really a Ukrainian civil war. Stalin spoke on telegraph with Ukrainian representatives who were also socialists, social democrats, actually, and told them it's not the Russian troops, it's your own troops, it's your own people are fighting you. It's your civil war, we are not involved. So that's exactly the situation which happened in 2014, after the second Ukrainian revolution. So maybe it is all about history, because you see, Ukraine went through the process of escaping from the empire. And the empire did respond with indiscriminate violence by bombing the cities and killing people based on literally nothing. And it got away with it. So, 100 years later, another revolution takes place in Ukraine, which is known as the Revolution of Dignity, the second of the two revolutions I have been discussing, 2013-2014. It is completely non-violent until the moment when the government troops start shooting at the crowd. At that point, about 100 people in the crowd are killed. And actually killed in a very unusual way. They are not execution style at all, but they are unarmed, but they just go ahead and they try to storm the government position, even so they are unarmed, realizing that the government might give an order to shoot, but they keep going ahead. And they kept going forward until 100 of them died, at which point the government troops got scared. They got scared that they were committing crimes against humanity, that there will be a responsibility, that perhaps there wouldn't be a cover-up like there is in Russia in such situations. And so they retreated. So these 100 people who died, as I said, in a kind of enormously heroic way, but also perhaps you can say, by disregarding any concept of safety, by thinking that if you go against the armed militia, the armed police, the armed troops, unarmed, they would realize that you are right, because the moral truth is on your side, not on theirs. But the troops, tried to apply the Russian understanding, created in Mr. Putin's wonderful little empire, that the troops are always right. There will be a cover-up, and therefore we need to start shooting and killing these people. What the profiles of these 100 people looked like is actually a very interesting exercise in understanding modern revolutions and the role of civil society. They came from all kinds of ethnic and religious backgrounds, from all the walks of society, some successful professionals, others basically unemployed, retirees, students. The first three included one Armenian and one Belarusian, so not Ukrainians at all, actually. And there was a significant mixture in terms of what languages they spoke at home. So it was not a nationalist revolution at all. In fact, it was the Armenian fellow who became the symbol of this revolution. His portrait frescoes were made, graffitos were made in the cities with his portrait, because he was a kind of calm person, very quiet, but came across as wise and spoke very carefully, very literate Ukrainian, which he obviously learned very recently. He also looked quite a bit, I would say, Christ-like, really. perhaps other people looking at him would say, oh no, he looked like an illegal immigrant. We need to beat him up. Because he looked Middle Eastern, for instance. This revolution was started, that revolution, which ended with the killing of 100 very unusual civic heroes, was started on Facebook, very famously, with a Facebook post by a journalist by the name of Mustafa, registers with you, it's not a Ukrainian name, Naim. He is Afghani, from Afghanistan, whose family escaped from Afghanistan at the point at which the Soviet Union left the secularist government there to its own fate and left the country. So he grew up in Ukraine, and when he was growing up, and up to this day really, until he became a recognizable face, he faced racism on the streets. More than once, the police were trying to beat him up or take him to the police station just to check his papers because he looked like potentially an illegal migrant. So he became the guy who started the revolution. He became a member of the parliament. He became one of the most recognizable faces in Europe, actually. And that point is here not just to make an emotional impact, really, because at once I want to recognize that of course there is racism in Ukraine, like in every society. Ukraine actually has a black parliamentarian who is also a wrestling champion. So you wouldn't want really to argue with him in a dark corner on the city street. And that, believe it or not, there was an incident in which some guys were trying to attack him without recognizing him for who he was. You know, not only an Olympic champion and member of the parliament and everything. So that's one point. There is racism in every society. But the second point is different. The revolution actually was started by the people who did not distinguish theirs based on ethnicity, language, blood. They had some other criteria in mind. This Afghani journalist said, we must end corruption. If we don't end corruption now, it will be with us forever, with our children and grandchildren. And he basically posted on Facebook saying, would you like to join me for a walk on the central square? And 1,000 people showed up, and then 10,000. And now, estimates made using satellite information say that on some days there were more than 1 million people on the central square and the adjacent streets. All of them showed up because this Afghani journalist who experienced racism in everyday life wanted them to fight against corruption. And of course now Ukraine has a Jewish president, which really made it difficult for Mr. Putin to argue that Ukraine was run by Nazi nationalists. Right. You know, the Jewish president who is actually an actor, a professional background. He's a very interesting character. When he was elected, we had an event at UVic talking about him and his background and how it actually happened. Also a very well-attended event. But he has an interesting charisma as an actor. He's not a big guy on screen. He's actually a little man very much like Charlie Chaplin. So if you remember Charlie Chaplin's character of Little Trump, in City Lights in particular, the little person with a big heart, who has big dreams, who constantly gets beaten up, but he's forever optimistic and he wants to change the world. So that would be the exact type of the charisma President Zelensky had as an actor. Thank you, John. Not to mention, of course, that he comes from a family of a Holocaust survivor. His family in Ukraine, he's actually Jewish on both sides, on his mother's side and his father's side as well. Not religious, but of course most Ukrainian Jews are not religious. They just don't practice, but they see it as sort of an ethnic identity with which they identify. He never denied being Jewish. He said in an interview with a Jerusalem Post, I think, that he was never asked about his Jewishness during the entire electoral campaign, right? So it's a very unusual person, both in terms of his personal charisma. Imagine electing Charlie Chaplin's Little Trump, your president, right? Also, at the end of City Lights, with the most famous film ending ever filmed, when he doesn't want the blind flower seller to know that he wants change, so he walks away quietly so that she thinks that she doesn't have to give him change, and she is happy and she is smiling. You know that Charlie Chaplin was great. Now, so it's very unusual for a society at war, for a society fresh out of the revolution, to elect a leader like that. And it basically tells you that we are perhaps misreading this society. And that's the point where I arrive at the reconciliation of my arguments. It's all about history, and it's not about history at all. The point where we start thinking about why Mr. Putin's military campaign clearly failed. The war is not over. All kinds of bad things are going to happen. We are going to find out about more bad things every day. Every day I open the Ukrainian news, I feel like crying, really. And I also know that these things are going to hit the Western news with a delay of 1 day, Canadian news usually with a delay of 2 days, right? So when at 7 a.m. this morning, CBC wanted me to talk about the Russian atrocities, I knew about the atrocities that were still not processed by the Russian media. So more are going to be hitting the news now, especially about the mass rapes of children. It's coming. Be ready, right? So there will be more. The war will go on. At some point, Russia will run out of steam. At some point, the world will realize that the Russian war is the incarnation of evil, really, morally, on the same scale as, trading with Hitler, buying. Fortunately, Hitler didn't have any gas and oil to sell, because if he had one, it would take a bit longer. So the war is still ongoing, but it's very clear that in the first months, something important was decided. The Russian campaign was built on some set of assumptions about the Ukrainian society. Very clearly, because of the use of small paratrooper groups trying to enter the big cities, the idea was that once you kill the leadership, blow up the buildings of the Ministry of Defense, kill the president and his family, apparently, according to the American and British intelligence, that was the plan, which is mind-boggling because, of course, they are Holocaust survivor family, right? So killing them wouldn't quite fit with Putin's agenda of denazifying Ukraine. It's actually the part which Hitler would have approved, really. Yeah, kill them. Right. So this kind of political and military logic would apply in a situation where the government is unpopular. The government is weak. It has no support of society. The society itself is not mobilized. There are no strong feelings among the people about protecting what they have. This failed. For that reason, Russia had to move the second group of the military reinforcements, which were, according to the plan, to be used for conquering some other regions. So they ended up using the reserves for what they thought they would not need to use the reserves here. But actually, you know what? There's an obvious parallel in history, which every historian of World War II will tell you about right away. There was once a military leader who invaded the country thinking that the country will collapse right away. The moment he said, you kick the door with your boots, the house will collapse. And that was, of course, Hitler attacking the Soviet Union, right? So that was his miscalculation. That's what doomed him, because he didn't realize that the people would basically fight for their lives, right? So it's highly ironic for a politician like Mr. Putin, who keeps talking about his fight against Nazis and neo-Nazis around the world, but who looks increasingly more like, that other fellow, whom Charlie Chaplin impersonated in The Great Dictator, the wonderful film from 1940, to be repeating the same mistakes politically and strategically, believing that it's enough to put paratroopers there and everything will be fine. Maybe you don't even need to fight. But it turned out now that they had to fight. When they had to fight, there is no explanation. The Russian media, and I have to read the Russian media for work, and I wouldn't recommend any of you to read the Russian media daily. It's a torture, really. Has been for about, I would say, 10 years. And it's sort of the same type of description you get about the media before World War I in Germany, before World War II in Germany, where it's all militarized, all about us testing the new missile, all about the American generals were so shocked, they fell from their chairs when they realized what a wonderful new missile we have. But then, of course, historians would know that it's very recognizable. You are militarizing your society. You're getting ready for the war. At some point, you will start the war because you start believing your own propaganda. And that's what so many commentators have been saying about this war too. That like so many dictators, Mr. Putin got embroiled into his own kind of struggle. He imagined the world as a black and white thing in which, of course, he was white and everything else was black. In order to express this, he actually had to claim that Ukrainians were Nazis. They have to be, because Stalin won World War II, of course, without any assistance from the West. Therefore, whoever is against Putin must be a Nazi. That actually brings him to a very interesting point, that the West is also Nazi. The United States, Canada, I'm not kidding, really. Really, yeah. If you read the Russian media, Canada is one of those Nazi countries supporting Nazis. So, okay. So, but if the historical moral truth is on his side, then indeed, this world has to collapse the moment you kick in the door with your boot. So he basically arrived into Ukraine with an understanding coming from the mid-20th century. Here, history becomes important again, right? On the assumption that those Ukrainian citizens who speak Russian in everyday life, those Ukrainian citizens who are ethnic Russians and identify as such, would immediately welcome Mr. Putin's troops because they are saving them from the Nazis. And these Russians and Russophones, Russian speakers, would bring flowers to the Russian tanks and kiss them. That didn't happen. But what it means actually, it's a very interesting thing, that we have a war which puts the ideologies of the mid-20th century against the 21st. Mr. Putin's idea of Ukraine was based on the notions of blood and belonging. Blood, land, territory. That's what the nation is about. If you're ethnic Russian, you must love Putin because he said so. But of course, the thing is that modern identities are not defined by birth, by ethnicity, by blood. Modern identities are political constructs. We decide to live in a democratic country. If we don't like politics in one province, we move to the other. Or especially if you don't like politics in one state of the United States, you move to somewhere else, or to Canada, for this matter. So we make a choice here. And he didn't realize that people who are ethnic Russians and speak Russian at home didn't like him. He thought they would love him because they're Russians. But turned out that they didn't want to live in a nasty dictatorship, which is increasingly isolated from the world. The only big city that the Russians managed to take in Ukraine in the south is a city of Kherson. It's a port city. There's a reason why they had more success in the south. I wouldn't go into this military strategic stuff. Let me just say the Crimea was there. They had captured Crimea previously. They had naval bases with all kinds of missiles. They had aviation there. So there was no cover for Ukrainians. So they managed to take the city of Kherson. And then a strange thing happened. The citizens of Kherson started showing up for public rallies protesting the occupation. with Ukrainian flags, even so all of them speak Russian. I really never heard a person from Kherson speak Ukrainian ever. But they showed up with Ukrainian flags, and the soldiers didn't know what to do. Because in Mr. Putin's Russia, everybody assumes that soldiers would not have to suppress the society because the society is so atomized, and they have this wonderful and efficient police which beats up everybody and arrests everybody, that the soldiers do not need to be trained to kill civilians. Ah, that's interesting. Well, then once, twice, 3 times, these manifestations happened, these rallies happened, and then they brought up the police. Actually, they were not particularly lucky, because one large detachment of the police coming from the Russian border to the south was hit by the Ukrainian troops. So lots of those policemen actually are left forever in the forests of Ukraine. But of course, Russia does not like acknowledging victims and on its side, or even burying them for that matter, right? Because one important thing which was revealed now when the Ukrainian troops recaptured all the small satellite cities around Kyiv was, of course, that the Russians never buried their own dead. They didn't care. Not only they didn't bury the people they have killed, but their own dead, right? So what kind of army is it, really? And of course, after it happened 2, 3, 4 times, the military command issued orders to treat the population in such way that the population listens to you. Also, when the soldiers realized that this war was becoming serious, that was not a tourist expedition to see wonderful Ukrainian rivers and something. Those people were fighting back. Strikingly, people we thought, would welcome Mr. Putin's troops are fighting back as well, volunteering as a matter of fact. That was the moment when the Russian army proceeded to its habitual brutality. And here is actually the other moment for me to bring in the history. We very rarely talk about the Red Army taking Germany in 1945. It's one of those inconvenient historical topics. They were liberating from Nazism, right? They were the ally of the West. But the amount of brutality they committed to the civilian population, of course, started coming up, especially in Europe, in recent decades. And the full picture is still emerging because of the time limits, because of people not being willing to report rape and such, of what in fact the Red Army was doing there. So it's actually a tradition which can be traced to all the engagements of the Soviet army, and even to the engagements of the Russian Imperial army in Europe during World War I. And it's a curious combination of brutality and ignorance, because the Soviet government didn't treat its soldiers very well. It's well known. When calculating the cost of the battle, they didn't have any counts about, okay, enter 50,000 dead on day one on our side. It's no big deal. Country is big. And so they didn't really care about soldiers, but they also allowed the soldiers to not care about civilians. So people who feel that they are worthless to their generals and their president, they also treat the enemy civilians in a certain way. And so they did. And so they did. After being scared for first few times, those soldiers started killing in Ukraine and raping on a colossal scale and looting. And it's just amazing what kind of images now we are going to see in the next few days. Like images of a armored infantry vehicle to which they have attached the stolen goods, like the tires for the Zhiguli, whatever, like really bad Soviet car. So you are stealing the tires from the old car and attaching them to your armored infantry carrier? Really? So what is this army, right? So when this realization started sinking in, the Ukrainian side realized we are united. We know exactly why we are here. We care about our civilians and each and every of us. And that's the principle established by the revolution. in an interesting way, the 100 dead revolutionary heroes were never seen as an abstract group represented by one person. All the monuments to them feature 100 portraits with names, occupations, and origins. And I thought, what an interesting way of commemorating your heroes, insisting on kind of boring bureaucratic notion. But then, of course, it came to me that it's precisely in the answer to the Soviet tradition in which the soldiers did not matter, in which there would be a symbolic figure of one soldier, or better yet, motherland, or better yet, some great leader. And maybe some names of the soldiers on the monument, but nobody really cared to look up all those names. And by the way, the Soviet Union and Russia are still, up to this day, have an enormous number of soldiers listed in World War II as having been missing in action, right? They have missing in action people from every conflict, even 21st century conflict, where you would think, you know, DNA analysis and all of that. But no, but it's about not caring. That's what it's all about. And then your troops also react in a similar way to the population, but that population comes from the background in which everybody volunteers. Like long lines of people bringing water, fundraising, delivering goods, keeping the soldiers warm, keeping them fed. It's like the entire society does it. The entire society does it in realization that each and every of us matters. So that's the reason why the Ukrainian army is successful. Not because it's better trained or better armed, but because it feels that it is part of a society which has the moral truth, as Tolstoy would say, on its side. And of course, the answer to that is brutality. We should not imagine that it just happens. The authorities always know about it, and the authorities turn a blind eye or encourage, in great many cases, the soldiers to be brutal to the population because that ensures that there will be no rallies of protest. And this is basically the point where I have to end at this intersection of history and present-day civil society, at this kind of clashing point of two narratives, the narrative of blood and belonging and land, and the narrative of a civil society in which, you know, an Armenian and Afghani person can be symbols of the revolution. So that is the type of middle of the 20th century suddenly coming after us, trying to catch us in the 21st century, to take us back. And they did succeed in one thing, taking us back into the Cold War period. But of course, the history of the Cold War, which my colleagues here study, teaches us one thing: we know how to win it. The Cold War was about information, human rights, and actually the value of human life. This point very often, I think, gets lost in the narratives of whatever American triumphalism. But it was really about the Soviets knowing that the state doesn't care about them, doesn't care about good clothing or whatever furniture available to them, doesn't care really about the supposedly free medical care, but it is actually in the West where your individuality, your being a person, is appreciated, where there is a concept of human rights. Not that it is universally accepted and enforced, but it exists as a principle. And this is how the Cold War really was won. With shortwave radios, people listening to jazz, which was forbidden in the Soviet Union, people being read long chapters from Russian novels that were never printed in the Soviet Union. This is how I first heard about the Gulag, from Solzhenitsyn's novel being read on BBC in Russian. And then, of course, I became friends with the son of the person, of the anchor who was reading the novel. And I told him that hearing his father read Solzhenitsyn was one of my first experiences as an anti-Soviet person, right? So the Cold War, we know how to fight it, but there's going to be more brutalities coming in news reports, on the news reports in the next little while, and there's going to be also an important issue which my colleagues in my other department are now struggling how to address, and that's of course the issue of whether there can be poetry after Auschwitz. whether there can be poetry after death camps, whether there can be culture after Bucha and the photographs of raped Ukrainian girls. And that's a big issue for Europe in particular, where many people feel that, canceling performance of this wonderful Imperial Russian ballet would be a bad thing, because Russian culture has nothing to do with all these things, but it does, of course, because the empire steals culture from its people. And the empire weaponizes culture, because these artists sign letters of support in support of Mr. Putin and his war. So this thing about canceling Russia and what of Russia doesn't have to be cancelled or what has to be cancelled, unfortunately, it requires critical analysis. We need to rethink so many things. And I'm really, really privileged to say that a colleague from Russia in my other department who has dual Canadian and Russian citizenship was actually the most outspoken of us, speaking against Mr. Putin's regime and the war. We are really proud to have her as a colleague. But I will always be lecturing about the imperial dimension of Russian culture from now on. Thank you so much.
So we're happy to take some questions. Serhy is happy to take some questions. So a little hard to see. Tom, can you turn up the lights for us a little bit, house lights? Oh, okay. Megan's got it. So we have a hard time seeing you right now, but if there's a question out there. I see one on the left back there.
I'm wondering, I come from parents from Russia and from Kiev when they were in Kiev, when they were in Russia and also Poland. And I'm Jewish. So I'm wondering, because I know a whole bunch of stuff, how many mercenaries do the Russian army have? What is the quality of hired help?
Can you repeat the question, Serhy?
I can. About the mercenaries in the Russian army, that's actually a very interesting example too, which I sometimes use in my talks and whatever. Russia really wants to fight this war with soldiers from the Caucasus, from the non-Russian republics, with actually Islamic nations. And this is a curious thing which illuminates for us Russia's dual nature as an empire. I didn't want to go into it in this talk, actually. A dual nature as an empire. It is the empire which knows that if you put these people from the Islamic region against those people in Ukraine, they are probably going to be brutal, and that's what you want. You will encourage that. But on the other hand, it also claims that Ukrainians are really Russians, brothers and sisters. So how can you possibly be an empire here and the brother here? It clashes, but there's so many things that clash about present-day Russia. And so we understand that the Russian army is trying not to send the conscripts into war zones. Actually, the Ukrainian army had the same practice until this invasion. So people who are conscripted at the age of 18, they are not sent into war zones. But of course, in Russia, there is a wonderful excuse. They have signed the contract, and they are now the contractors. Of course, it turned out immediately that most contractors never seen those contracts. Somebody else signed for them, like always in the Russian army. And that same person also stole whatever, tires and gas and sold whatever, arms. So the corruption is immense. And that came out on the Russian news in a very spectacular way. The only person who can still say some truth in Mr. Putin's state is the widow of his teacher, the widow of a Democratic mayor of St. Petersburg, Sobchak. She is a senator, and she can sometimes say things that for somebody else would mean disaster. And her daughter also has a little bit of a license. So she said that, of course, Mr. Putin didn't know about that. She was sure. But some generals made a mistake of forcibly sending the conscripts there, to which there was actually a response. Yeah, there was a mistake. We are going to punish whoever was responsible, and the conscripts will be recalled back, and the contractors will be sent in. But one thing which becomes really obvious is that these contractors are disproportionately from Dagestan and Chechnya. So they kind of selected those culturally most distanced from Ukrainians. Even so, the war is allegedly being fought in names of brotherhood. Kind of they recover the brothers Ukrainians. And also, of course, it turned out very quickly that Russia is running out of contractors. And here we open the entire Pandora box of the Russian army being second in the world, whatever. And the Ukrainians now saying, well, no, it's second in Ukraine. and what number in the world, it's a open question, right? So they don't actually have too many battle-ready troops, which is a disaster. And so you are right, they are now recruiting openly and also recruiting in interesting locations in Syria, very famously or infamously, right? So my son-in-law is actually Syrian. And he says, they are not being sent there to win, they are being sent there to die, really. Just in order to demonstrate the wonderful global appeal of the Russian idea. But it's interesting, right? That it's kind of not too many Russians seem to be volunteering. And also Russians don't seem to be good soldiers. And Putin is running out of soldiers. And yes, they're using the mercenaries. And actually the Ukrainian side also said that it's going to accept foreign volunteers. But these are actually very interesting volunteers. I would hesitate to call them mercenaries, because Ukraine actually has a Chechen battalion. But these are the Chechens who oppose to the bloody regime of Kadyrov in Russia. So these are the oppositionists who basically dropped well-paying jobs in the West to come to fight against the Russian Empire, which had conquered their land. And also now there is a Belarusian battalion. Even so, Belarus is another nasty dictatorship in Europe, which participates really in the war without acknowledging it, but there are also Belarusian oppositionists who have volunteered to fight on the Ukrainian side. So it's the war which challenges a lot of stereotypes.
I see a question in the front, Joan. Thanks.
Yeah, just wondering, a couple things. One, I've been enjoying Servant of the People. I've been feeling guilty as hell that I'm retreating into Servant of the People to cope with what's going on. But he's an amazing person. And there's so many parallels in Servant of the People. And one thing I'm wondering about is how the people are feeling in Lithuania and in some of the other neighboring countries, if there's a feeling of threat there.
Yeah, I will repeat it for the audience. The Servant of the People is a television series which consolidated Zelensky's reputation as a potential political figure. He was famous before that, really. But in the TV series Servant of the People, he plays a history teacher who likes, like me, by the way, going into rants about this being completely wrong, that being completely wrong. So he was filmed by a student on a smartphone. So this video became enormously popular, and he immediately gets elected as president, and then he needs to clean up the system. And he realizes how difficult it is and how outnumbered he is, and he really needs to reach out to the popular base in order to do something. So the Servant of the People is also the name of the political party which Zelensky created just before being elected president, and that party then went on for the first ever in the history of Ukraine constitutional majority in the parliament. So they didn't need any coalitions at all because the people gave them the mandate. And it sort of explains a lot about Zelensky. And I just wrote one important memo in which I actually addressed this point, saying that I thought it was his mask as an actor, really. I thought it was his television persona that looked so genuine and concerned with the people until we saw him during the war, at which point we realized that that's what he is, really, right? So, so the Servant of the People played an important role, But he also played all kinds of comedy roles and cabaret style humor, which is still popular in Europe. Actually, we could have cabaret shows here as well. Kind of really.
I think you'd be good at that.
Yeah,
Serhy.
need some music and stand-up comedy. Yeah, he's really good at stand-up comedy as well, by the way. So it's not like his entire career projected him as a potential political leader. It's like people gave him a chance because they were so disillusioned with the system. And that's why his party of mostly new faces received outright constitutional majority, 2/3 of the parliament, because people felt we need to clean up this corrupt slate of politicians. Like they need to be sent home. And of course, then he became a formidable wartime leader and turned out to be really like Charlie Chaplin, you know, this little guy with big heart, right? Which also accidentally undermined Mr. Putin's great design of calling the Ukrainian government Nazis, which was really good, really good. Because, you know, there are moments when even Putin doesn't know what to say. Yeah. And it's good to see him in those moments. Right. Okay. So, but the question was actually about the other Eastern Europeans. And that is a very complex issue because there are vulnerable Eastern European countries that are members of NATO. And Canada happens to be particularly committed to the country which is most vulnerable. Just don't use it for any panic, okay? So it's a good thing that we are committed to this nation. Not just we. It's Latvia. It's Latvia, the smallest of the 3 Baltic states, which is also one of those states that Russia consistently labels Nazi or neo-Nazi state. And it's also a state in which there is a considerable Russian minority living compactly on the Russian border. That really is the same recipe as with Ukraine. But my thinking goes like this. If Ukraine were to become an easy case, then Putin would have been encouraged. Okay, so they did nothing about Ukraine. Let's see what they do if I go into Latvia. Maybe they would go into consultations. You know, the European Union can do nothing without consultations. And then there's always somebody in the European Union who is really a big friend of Putin's, like the Prime Minister of Hungary, recently re-elected with a stunning majority, which is just, the rest of Europe doesn't know what to do about. Or this Foreign Minister of Austria, the woman who danced with Putin, that was famous video, her dancing with Putin and then receiving a high-paying job at the Russian gas monopoly. Yeah. Also, the German Chancellor, who was receiving enormous salaries. Yeah. So anyway, but I think now that Ukraine is a tough case, I think Latvia and everybody else should feel much, much safer. But it pains me to say that it comes at the expense of the, you know, Ukrainian soldiers and women and children and civilians, really.
Just a note, The Servant of the People is now available on Netflix if you're wanting to watch it. Yeah.
Enjoy it. He's a great actor.
A question on the left there in the corner.
Just curious with the, it's all doom and gloom, because it is. But with the light sort of at the end of the tunnel, like the shining the bright light on how wrong Putin was, how hollow all of his appeal was to, like, France and Le Pen and, you know, and the United States with a lot of the far right, like that image of that strong man that they all had elevated so much. And the results of the world coming together and saying this isn't going to happen, and having a country like China watching. As terrible as it is, do you see, as it evolves, how it could be a real, like you say, shining that bright, disinfecting light on what has led up to that point in the world, not just regionally or locally, but in the world, that had been gathering and gathering, that this might be the disinfectant for it?
Well, I see your point. Yeah, it can be a good disinfectant, this whole culture of canceling Russia, actually. There's a good aspect to it in a sense that, you know, you're right. Russia under Putin has been pumping money into the European far right. Everybody knows that. And yet somehow the European left continued to be in love with Putin. I just completely don't understand that. But nevertheless. But now for both of them, for the extreme right and for the left as well, who still recognize the issues of democracy, parliamentary politics and such, Putin has become poisonous. And that, I think, is really an important development, that he became an incarnation of evil, to some degree like Hitler was. Well, maybe not yet on the same scale, but as I said, just give our North American media a few days to catch up on the news from the Kiev region, and he will be there. And that united Europe in a way which the Americans thought would not happen. Of course, the news today about the plans to cancel purchases of coal from Russia is only one step. They really need to go into canceling the oil and getting rid of relying on the Russian gas, which is the most difficult for Europeans. But it is an economic issue, ultimately. I mean, they will find some solution, because I think the step which leads to it is all important, and that's indeed a step of recognizing that you cannot depend economically on a person who is becoming an evil incarnate as we speak. And that means there will be fewer Russian rubles going into the coffers of the European right wing, which is good. The European right would not be so powerful. And there would be some, leftist disillusioned, but maybe it would be time for them to do some reading about Mr. Putin's Russia and find out that he positions himself as the extreme Christian right. They would be surprised, but perhaps it's time for them to do this reading. And you're right, Europe is never going to be the same. But I think the world is never going to be the same, period. Because it really is, and historians are really wary of making claims like that. But what is going on now in Ukraine is going to determine a large chunk of the 21st century, or perhaps the entire 21st century for that matter. Because if Russia can get away with what it wants to do, either at stage 1 or stage B, whatever, plan C, then, as you say, China is watching. There's a reason why China issued some vague statements against NATO, but did not fully support Mr. Putin economically, because it has its own interests, but it wants to see what is happening because there is an issue of Taiwan, and there are all kinds of issues. There are all kinds of wannabe dictators, even in Europe, who would see that, if you can get away with this, then maybe everybody should start challenging the borders, occupying the territories, and then we are back into the mid-20th century. So the strong response on Ukraine actually is a signal that this is not likely to happen, and I hope it's not likely to happen. But it would be then important for future historians to recognize that that was the moment when we were able to stop it, as opposed to kind of trying to satisfy Hitler's interests in Munich in 1938 and feeling really good about it and landing in Britain and showing this piece of paper saying, I brought peace for our time, as one British prime minister did. So everybody is learning lessons of history finally, I think, here. And fundamentally, I think Putin is not going to win. What would be the price for my native Ukraine? That's a different question.
Back in the back, then.
In light of the accusations around the Holocaust, what do you think the implications are of the missile having hit Babin Yar?
In light of accusations about what?
In light of the accusations around the Ukrainians being Nazis, what do you think is the implications of the damage done to Babin Yar?
Right. Thank you. Not just to Babin Yar, but I think that's what hit the Western news. Then when 2 Russian rockets landed on the edge of Babin Yar, which is the largest extermination place where the Nazis killed the largest number of Jews. Actually, I think it's the largest number of people killed in one day as well, 34,000 in 2 days. And it's major memorial place of the Holocaust. But also there was another one near the city of Kharkiv where the artillery shells actually damaged the menorah. The monument in the form of the menorah was destroyed by the Russian artillery shells, and everybody thought that there's a cruel irony to that, right? Because you accuse Ukraine of being Nazis and neo-Nazis, but you actually destroy Holocaust memorials. And Yad Vashem in Israel issued a statement, a very strong one, on Babi Yar, saying that Babi Yar is about, remembering the never again part. So when rockets land there and kill 5 people in the process, That's not the way we should be proceeding in the 21st century. It's also a big issue of how sometimes Ukraine gets stereotyped. So I very often encounter with journalists, and in fact, as we speak, I'm thinking how to answer a journalist from the Wall Street Journal on that very issue. That people seem to think that Ukraine needs to come to terms with its anti-Semitic past and collaboration. But Russia doesn't, because Russia was so wonderful, because the Red Army, which took Berlin, was mostly Russian and whatever. Stalin was so great. And of course, that's one of those painful things which need to be deconstructed, because the Russian collaboration during World War II was enormous, just completely swept under the rug. You wouldn't, in fact, in Russia, you would not even be able to talk about it at all, about the entire Russian army fighting on Hitler's side and such. But of course, the beauty of Ukraine isn't that it's not a single-track history, it's not a single-track political development. There's always a place for the opposition and disagreement. And so recently there was actually a disagreement about Babi Yar, because there are two competing memorial projects about how to build a major memorial center. One was to be funded by Russian oligarchs, friends of Putin. The other was kind of more coming from the Ukrainian government. I had issues with both of them to some degree, but I thought perhaps they would be reconciled. And then the war came, so that would be decided after the war. But what occurred to me also was that it's really good that we could argue. It's really great that I can say, you know what, I don't really agree with either of your projects. And that's because, as one Ukrainian historian said, so we Ukrainians also need an important place in mourning our Jews, because that would make us think through the collaboration, which of course existed, right? So it is a more open culture, a culture more open to, not only accepting a Jewish president, but actually thinking about what happened during World War II. Whereas in Russia, it's single track. We have won. We are great. And actually, the most popular slogan in the Russian media, we can do it again. You know what it means? They mean by that the West is Nazis. Ukrainians are Nazis, but also beyond Ukrainians, over there in Europe, everybody is also Nazi. So we can do it again. We can come to Europe and conquer it. This is the kind of single-track memory which is then transformed to fit Mr. Putin's political agenda. I don't know. I don't know what to say about it.
We'll take you see somebody here?
Yeah, right here.
Okay, go for it.
How important is India's role in the whole of the scheme of international involvement?
India's role. Ukraine doesn't really have all that many contacts with India. Ukraine is one of those European countries where it's very cheap to be a foreign student. So Ukraine had lots of Indian students who were having trouble leaving the country, and some of them complained of being mistreated, which I fully believe is possible. But also what never registered with the Western media was, of course, that they were the young males, right? And everybody else on evacuation trains were women and children and the elderly. So there was this kind of thing that you want to say, yes, there is racism, but there's kind of the other background that we need to look at. So there were plenty of Indian students who had an issue getting out of Ukraine. But other than that, India doesn't play a large role in relations with Ukraine, either economically or politically. Whereas for Russia, it is a major partner. Kind of lots of Russian military imports go to India. Lots of oil goes to India. And actually, India, as you know, is one of those countries which said that it will continue buying Russian oil. Here, I think the context should really be greater, and greater than my expertise as a historian, because I think China is somehow in the picture here. So, and India wants to position itself in a certain way so that the relationship with China does not become the most important relationship for Russia. I think there is a bit of a competition there. But basically, it's a buyer of oil and military equipment. And beyond that, I don't have much to say about it. But perhaps my other colleagues would. And there was somebody on this
I
side.
saw a question in the very back, and maybe this will be our last or second last question. Yeah, very back.
Thank you very much for a brilliant talk. It was very, very interesting.
Thank you. I do.
A question, Serhy?
The Canadian Arctic. I absolutely do. And that, early on when this full-scale invasion started, I was asked quite a few times by the journalists to spell out the implications for Canada, and that was my immediate answer. So if Putin has an easy time in Ukraine, and he doesn't see the countries vouching for each other, helping each other, that could well be his next step. Because he needs to, the nature of his regime is actually fairly interesting for political scientists, which I am not. It's charismatic dictatorship in which the authority is based not really on the elections, because everybody knows the elections are fixed, but on the amount of adoration invested into the dictator. And for that reason, he has to appear bare-chested and constantly, all this Putin stuff, strange stuff. But there's another element which often gets lost, and this other element is that every now and then, he has to show the West its place. And that's precisely how it would be spelled out in the Russian media. We need to show the West its place. So the Ukrainian war was also intended really as a war on the West. The Russian newspapers proclaimed that the NATO attack was imminent. That's really what I've read in Russian newspapers like 3 days before the Russian invasion, that the NATO attack was imminent through Ukraine. Yeah, NATO attacks. Okay, exciting. And that's why they invaded. But of course, if it is presented as the war on the West, it also must be won. Right? The macho reputation of Mr. Putin would suffer from any defeat, but especially from a defeat in what was presented as part of the West. If he were to succeed, or at least to have what the American diplomats call this disgusting term, an off-ramp. Yeah, try an off-ramp with Hitler, yeah. They have tried. Okay, so if he were to be able to present it as a victory, he would have to repeat it. That's the trick. So maybe a couple of years down the road, after wonderful successes in Ukraine, he would need to invade maybe Latvia or maybe reclaim the Russian Arctic, which of course is truly Russian and historically has always been Russian, right? And whatever. So yes, absolutely. We need to be watching very seriously any threatening move on the part of the Russian Federation, because they do intend to do it. Moreover, they have to do it. If they don't do it, they would lose face, really. That's the nature of the Putin dictatorship. And if you think that the moment he dies, there would be a wonderful free democratic Russia, no, I don't think so. Because they've spent too much time being addicted to Channel 1, the official Russian television. All the other channels are basically the same. All of them feel like the empire. So it will take quite a while. So yes, I think the Canadian government has started the program of buying these diesel, whatever they are called, frigates that are really icebreakers. I think one of them stopped in Victoria last year, was it? I posted it on Facebook even, actually. You know what? Because I realized that's exactly the thing a scholar of Ukraine must watch. Because Putin is looking for an opening. So if he cannot get an opening here, he would start looking for an opening there. And of course, Comrade Xi, the leader of China, watches Putin. And so there's a long chain of events that may possibly result from that.
Can I ask a question about Poland and Hungary? Both have what we might call in the West kind of right-wing governments, and maybe moving towards fascism. And yet Poland, of course, has stepped up and done some heroic work in responding to the attack on Ukraine. Hungary, maybe not so much. But what is Europe to do with these two, if you like, I don't know, fascist governments that are on their borders, but also members of NATO?
Yeah. I just 2 days ago wrote a long article for the Polish magazine about that, which was intended at first for the internet version, but now they said it will be in the paper version too. Specifically targeting the Polish, they say, political elite. I don't know whether every Polish magazine claims to be targeting political elites and whatever. But nevertheless, my point in that op-ed was that What makes a real difference in the Polish case is that it was not the government, or not only the government, which supported Ukraine, but was actually individual Poles. The entire nation mobilized, very much the same way the Ukrainians mobilized during those revolutions. And you have perhaps seen it on the news, it made the news in the West as well, that the European Union sent the commissioner to examine the refugee camps in Poland. And turned out that Poland had no refugee camps, because all the refugees up to that point were taken into Polish families, like millions, really, of Polish families. And the same in Lithuania, by the way. So that leads us to a dilemma. The Polish government is leaning toward, it's not as right-wing as Hungary, I think, but Ukrainians had issues with Poland arguing about historical memory and all kinds of things. But it turned out that the society in Poland remembered 1980 and 1981. They remembered the wait for the Russian tanks to start rolling into the country. They remembered how the entire country mobilized for this independent trade union, which millions of them joined the Solidarity trade union in Poland, which became a powerful example of how people can speak back to what was essentially a dictatorial state socialist government. So they had this experience which made them, which prepped them for the notion of helping Ukrainians just basically by doing everything. And I think I was stunned, really. Everybody in Ukraine was stunned. For all this propaganda about Russian being brothers being broadcast for decades, the most popular meme on Ukrainian social media in recent weeks was this: Ukraine has no brothers. That much is clear. However, it has a sister. Because both Poland and Ukraine, these are the gendered languages in which everything has to be either male or female or neuter. So Poland and Ukraine are grammatically female, so they are sisters. Whereas if you talk about the people, they are grammatically male, masculine. And so there was so much going into this meme. All kinds of things. The protest against this military masculinity, the endorsement of women's role during the war and any crisis, the rewriting of history, the new sense of Europe. So I wrote this article which was called Ukraine and Poland, Two European Sisters. I'm waiting for it to be, I really like it in English, but it will be published in the Polish translation. What do I do? I can read Polish. Yeah.
We'll take one final question then, okay.
What should Canada be doing, militarily, politically, or economically, to assist the situation in Ukraine?
Thank you. That's the most popular question I get asked. Canada is doing a lot. Canada has limited capabilities in terms of military potential and such, but it also has the enormous and very committed population of Ukrainian Canadians. And I think they should have been playing a greater role in Ukraine in the years leading to this. Canada, together with the UK and US and some European players, have been training the Ukrainian military. Everybody thought it was just whatever, just to click the box. Turned out that they actually trained a wonderful Ukrainian army, right? Canada has not been sending too much in terms of arms and ammunition, but we don't really have all that much. But Canada was standing with Ukraine always in terms of moral support. And it was, in fact, our government, I think, which has the largest number of people under sanctions in Russia. Perhaps you don't realize, but Russia sanctions the Western officials, right? Which, of course, doesn't mean that they cannot come to Russia. They can. But if, Krista Freeland, who is of Ukrainian-Canadian background, of course, I know her family in Edmonton. So if she were to travel to Russia as a private individual, she is under sanctions, so she cannot cross the border. So if she travels on diplomatic passport, it's different. So there are a lot of Canadian officials under Russian sanctions, but there was a brief moment when Ukrainians felt tiny bit iffy about Canada, and that was a brief moment when everybody around the world crossed this line between sending the defensive equipment to Ukraine and sending the lethal weapons to Ukraine. And even Germany crossed this line. And it really takes major atrocities for Germany to cross this line. Because Germany, after the lessons of World War II, is one of those countries which would never do that. And yet they did it. And then it was somehow Canada left behind. And there were strange news releases about, well, some ministers are objecting to... Really? Can we name those ministers? Can we put them under Russian sanctions, please? You know, because they seem to be doing the Russian work here. Like, what is Canada has to lose? We don't really have economic relationship with Russia. I don't think we do. And the Russian media, we are the Nazi country anyway. Yeah, and they go around Canada photographing some cemeteries where Ukrainians are buried, photographing Ukrainian national symbols in the cemeteries, and then publishing articles in the Russian press about, you see, Canada is full of Nazis, of course. Of course it is, because it's part of the West. You know, democracy is, of course, a Western conspiracy. You cannot use the term democracy in Russia, by the way, no matter how much you love Putin. If you choose to use this term, you must speak of sovereign democracy. Sovereign means Russian way, okay? So everything has to be sovereign. Now there's, of course, the McDonald's haven't left Russia now officially. They are now inventing the sovereign Russian names for the main items on McDonald's menu, which I think is a joke on social media, but it's a kind of a joke which underscores the idiosyncratic, the kind of, you know, absurdist quality of Russian politics.
So I'm going to thank Dr. Yekelchyk in a second, but before I do, where is that bag, the donation bag? Has it been everywhere? Has everybody had a chance? All right, so there it is. It's coming around to the front there, and if you miss it, it'll be at the front door before you leave. So that's one thing. Secondly, you know, we've had a full house here. I think Herman's wasn't quite expecting all of us to come today, so I'd like to thank Dylan, who's at the front door, Megan and Lana and Shannon, who have been doing the floor service for us today, and Tom on the lights and the sound. So thank you. And most of all, of course, I'd like you to join me in thanking Dr. Yekelchyk for an amazing talk. And without a bit of notes and in the face of having family and friends still in Ukraine and dealing with all of these matters.
Thank you so much.
Oh, yeah, where can we find your book, Serhy?
I think it's everywhere, all over the internet as well. Yeah.
So.
Unfortunately, yeah.
I'll say that this is our last Café Historique for the season, so we look forward to seeing you back in the fall. So thank you very much.